All right, what's up, everyone? We're back for another online Polymath Salon / podcast. I don't know which one I'm going to call it yet, but we're back with some returning guests. We have Yo-Yo, Lucy, and then a new special guest, Shreshed, and they're all like super smart, cool people. But we also have a few other guests that are joining us. If anybody wants to give a quick intro, let's start with Yo-Yo.
Oh, hello. I'm currently a CS student at Minerva University, and I'm very interdisciplinary. So some of my interests are neurotech and applied cryptography, things in the human-computer interaction sphere, like form dynamics, and currently scent computing.
Hey, I'm Shresh. I'm a CS and linguistics student at Northeastern, and I do embeddings and digital twin research at the MIT Media Lab. I'm really into world building and linguistics and conlangs, and so yeah, that's mostly what I try to work on in my free time.
I'm Lucy. I do edge machine learning, embedded systems, a lot of electronics. I want to do more machine learning, so that's kind of what I'm trying to learn.
My name is Dugan. I work for the Wolfram Institute, and my background is I'm a mathematician with a focus in geometry.
Hey, I'm a perfumer doing work for the Qualia Research Institute. I am starting into mathematics like topology and complex analysis, and am interested in doing like modeling of the olfactory manifold.
I'm an affiliated researcher with the Wolfram Institute, and I'm also a PhD physics student at FAU and a member of the MPCR lab.
Hey, I'm a recent data science master's grad. I've spent a long time in innovation, R&D, startup technology development spaces, with a little background in cognitive science and phenomenology and things like that, and doing some work in innovation, leadership, and strategy spaces now.
Cooper, if you want to give a quick intro.
I am into building sensory augmentation devices and testing them on myself.
The cognitive biohacker.
Oh, hello. Yeah, I'm an engineer who works on AI agents. Yeah, that's me.
All right, Veronica.
Hi, I am a data engineer right now, mostly working on sort of tooling for knowledge graphs, and also interested in the sort of transformer adjacent elements of this scent research. So I'm excited to learn.
I'm a PhD student at Berkeley studying the scaling laws of large neural networks.
All right. Real quick before we do start, I hope everyone got a chance to see the Scott Aronson video, which is doing relatively well on the channel, much more than I originally thought it would. And it's getting some good engagement. And it seems that people had such a good time that we're probably going to go and do another over there in some point, some capacity in the summer. But yeah, all right, Yo-Yo, let's take it away.
Okay, so here I will share a bit about scent engines and bases. Throughout history, we can see there are some cracked engineers, and the first instance was in ancient Mesopotamia, and people found hundreds of tablets documenting the scent recipes. There was a female scent perfumer named Taputi, and she used combinations of oil, flowers, calamus, cypress, and other ingredients, mostly for royal purposes. It's interesting that they had distillation techniques, but without actual equipment. So this makes their scalability limited. Yeah, so I was going to say the vibes for ancient Mesopotamia is that since they have distillation techniques without proper equipment, the scalability is kind of bottlenecked, but at the same time, the impact, quirkiness, and execution is relatively high. So next up, there are engineers from the Islamic Golden Age. So Al-Kindi's book had 107 scent formulas, and this is where they also invented scent pyramids with the top, middle, and base notes, as far as I can tell. And they had some more equipment, the alembic stills for distillation. So distillation in modern era is like taking water mixed with flour material and boiling it with heat so that the materials will vaporize, and afterwards they will condense, separate it into oil and water. The oil is the essential oil. And here, there are some scientific principles being established with mechanisms, and the impact is still relatively high with reasonable execution, I would say. Next up, people began to synthesize molecules in labs this is from South American tonka bean. So for this coumarin molecule, it is cost effective. So the implications here are you can synthesize things reliably and affordably. And at the same time, like quite a long gap in time, in the 1960s, there are some analytical instrument boom for detection of scent and decomposing them. So scent tasters can finally take a break. Here the impact is still high. Scalability, quirkiness scalability would say are high, and explainability can suffer a bit. Now, afterwards, some people have heard of Lee Cronin's computer. So the scope here would be anything that is computable and is physically allowed and is synthetically accessible would be synthesized by this machine. And obviously, we don't have time to go through very in detail of this computer. Here's a picture of it. And for inputs and outputs, as typically talked about in computation, we have the reagents and catalysts are physical materials being inputted. The programming language is like software inputs, and they will be transformed into synthesis pathways for the compiler, which is then turned into hardware language. Then a compound is outputted. However, this seems like infinitely scalable because it is software. However, it seems like the execution is somewhat limited with the amount of compounds it has and just the sheer size of the machine as well. Why do people care so much about scent engines? One thing is because it can give them more extrapolative power for new scents in the chemical space or perceptions for subjective experiences. And if they have a mechanism of explanation, that would be great. It also compresses information for human brains to understand and to compare across different perfumers, discuss ratings among ourselves or across a species. So then I also found some canonical bases of scent. First, starting out with the handcrafted bases, there was initially an older prism in 1916. As you can see here, there's a perceptual space with 6 corners, like flowery, foul, fruity, spicy, gauze, and resinous, that signify the property of the chemical. But then this is their first attempt in making chemical communication more objective. But I think that they still had a limited amount of test subjects, so the reliability is highly limited here. And predictive power, given a new molecule, how well does the prism predict human subjective experience? It's not very good, and the coverage is here obviously limited because there are only 6 corners. Validity is okay, explainability is high given the limited scope. Afterwards, there is stereochemical theory that tried to describe, so someone looked at 600 organic compounds and found there are 7 primary odors, and tried to propose this like key and lock configuration between the compound molecules and the human receptors. But obviously nowadays we know that there are 400 olfactory odor receptors in humans, so that the scope here is also limited. Predictive power is reasonable given there is a mechanism of explanation, and explainability I would say is still reasonable. And Drobnik's atlas was a big data attempt on chemicals. I think there were maybe thousands of compounds being looked at, and they found there were, through PCA, there were 20 main clusters, and a chemical like butanoic acid is shown here on the wheel, the radar chart. And there is also a scatter plot showing what it's like to use this atlas for different chemicals. So I would say this overall has a rating of 6 out of 10. These handcrafted canonical bases are easy to understand, but usually have limited coverage or predictive power, and reliability is like still suffering. Then there are some other bases like valence. You can talk about the pain-pleasure scale, and with no valence, this picture is from the Qualia Research Institute, but I think that it still resembles the prism, sort of. So I will give the rating a 4 out of 10 in general. Then there's transmutation of senses. You can talk about chemicals being transmuted into music, or more often the other way around. But still, this kind of resembles the 20th century methods. So I would say the rating here is 5 out of 10. There is a higher, slightly higher coverage in what can be described through different sensory modalities. And then, of course, human nose receptors, as previously mentioned, have 400 different kind of them. So there's a 400 dimensionality. Here, the rating seems higher, like 7 out of 10. So this is an attempt in grounding the bases in biological substrate. But also, like, the explainability here is high, but if you use machine learning techniques, I think the coverage will be wider. Like, Google created this graph neural network that can go from chemical structure to the perception by humans. And there's another challenge on Kaggle that does the same thing from I think chemicals to or maybe the other way around, from human order ratings to molecular descriptors. And comparing these two approaches in machine learning, it seems like graph neural networks do slightly better than the dream challenge, but the improvement is only marginal. The coverage here is much wider, but the explainability will suffer. And someone took Google's graph neural networks and created a startup called Osmo. I think in here they also had 2,000 molecules that were being studied. Yeah, I think so. It is trained on extensive data sets, approximately 5,000 molecules, and there was like some high dimensional spaces of 256 dimensions. So that is it for a machine learning basis. That's like very quick description. And of course, bioreceptor bases can be compared to eNodes, but that is not my area of expertise. So I think Lucy will talk more about it.
Okay, so I'm going to start with just talking about like what classifying scent information entails, and then we will talk about some specific sensing platforms. Olfactory information is very difficult to describe and very difficult to generalize. So like compared to light and sound, which have discrete frequency domains and just like a spread of amplitudes on that domain, olfactory events, scents themselves are the complicated combination of an array of different compounds, and only like a subset of the actual constituent compounds are sensed by the combination of olfactory neurons that a given organism has. So machine and biological olfaction have a very similar structure. And the form of information in both cases is very similar. So there's a diversified sensor array. And the diversification is important because these are a bunch of very highly sensitive sensors or receptors that have overlapping sensitivities to the myriad of compounds that actually readily disperse. And then, so in biological cognition, there's really three main layers, where there's the diversification of the actual receptors, which is mediated by gene expression. There's the activation patterns, and there's the event detection. So I'll get to this in a second, but so there's the diversity of the array itself and kind of what chemical affinities it has. There's the kind of next layer that you can imagine it being the first set of hidden layers or reservoir layers. And then there's the output of the actual olfactory layer where it goes to the rest of the brain, and it's associated with other events and stuff. We don't actually need to get into this, but olfactory information, when an organism tries to detect a given scent object, it's not just trying to detect a given list of compounds to some degree of accuracy. So like in certain insects, they need to be able to like smell a plant that emits one strong scent, like that can be sensed from all over. And maybe they get up to it and it's like some wasps will lay eggs in a plant if there's flowers and not lay eggs in a plant if there aren't flowers or something like that. And then they can only really detect that consistently through smell. And there are specific olfactory receptor neurons for specific, like profoundly significant ecological cues that are really only sensitive to one specific, like compound that they encounter. One example is like that, like there are flowers like this. But the less sensitive things where there aren't like specific receptors that like go, like a better example is like moth mating pheromones. An adult silk moth is alive for like 3 days and has to search a huge area to find a mate. Their little antennae are extremely sensitive to the one specific type of pheromone, and that type of olfactory receptor neuron doesn't really respond to anything else. And that's what allows it to be so ridiculously good at kind of scanning. But for the less sensitive things, they have to kind of be like associatively constructed, which like kind of like the language of tokenization. And some of the language kind of more familiar to machine learning now came into like describing scent gestalts and scent information much earlier. So like because of the fact that, a given plant that will be more or less palatable because it's actually like several different mixed scents. So there's different ways of describing that. But so like the basic structure is like, these are the 3 levels I was talking about, which back here kind of, maps to these 3 in different representations. The idea is the same basically though, which is that like there's this certain like the actual difference in the response patterns of the different sensors and the like intermediate training stage and then like the output layer are kind of like or I guess like how that's processed are kind of independently adjustable. But so like the diversity of sensor profiles enhances sense separability. So like really any given organism will have anywhere from like a few dozen to hundreds of different like actual olfactory receptor neurons. When we're trying to do olfactory sensing, we're not like I guess here's the analogy that we can use. On one end, it's like you're basically doing HPLC and micro and trying to detect the exact level of every possible relevant compound of interest. And on the other end, it's like purely combinatorial processing of a small range of specific VOCs. And then kind of we're meeting in the middle by having like the redundancy of different sensors kind of overlapping, and that will like enhance the separability and make it more resilient to context or like to the background context. So the like kind of different like sensors are all tunable to some degree. Like just the different types of gas composition sensors. Like, how should I say? They will have given chemical affinities, and they will have like different response to level like sensitivities to different ranges of compounds, depending on like in biological sensors, like the gene expression and various electronic sensors, there's other mechanisms. But so like the main types of sensor, there's amperometric, this is the cheapest. Everyone kind of is familiar with this. If you see like really any cheap like CO2 or like specific gas sensor, it's going to be working on this principle. There's some actual electrochemical reaction going on inside that you can measure that is very selective. MOX is generally less selective, so it'll respond to a wider array of VOCs. And it also, like the actual response profile can be adjusted through like adjusting the heater. So you can like change the duty cycle on the heater and adjust the temperature and then like adjust the response of an individual MOX sensor. And this can like increase the separability of sense in different contexts. Which we'll get more to later. There's a SAW resonator, which is kind of the same principle as a quartz crystal microbalance. The way this one works is you have like a surface acoustic wave generated across kind of this surface, and you have a micro machine little thing in the middle that has some layer that is made to attach to a specific compound or group of compounds, and it will like be detectable in how it impacts the like resonant frequency of the microstructure. It's pretty cool. There's surface plasmon resonance. This one actually has had commercial success. I forget the name of the company. I'll pull it up in a second. But the idea is that you have like an array of nanoparticles on a like kind of sensing surface. And they bind to a host of different VOCs, and they're kind of spatially separated. And then you do like surface plasmon resonance spectroscopy, where you kind of like look at the output when you shine light on it, and you like take a picture, and you compare like the kind of fingerprint. So like to kind of generalize here, back to here, what we're exploiting to do olfaction is like the combinatorial. I mean, I don't want to go too into this because I feel like I kind of went over it a bunch in our last talk, but like we need to have some way of having a tunable, like variable response to different, classes of volatile organic compounds. And all of these situations, like the way that we're adjusting the tuning can either be like in this case, like we're just modifying the electrochemistry of the electrolyte. In this case, we can like get a more dynamically tunable profile by the fact that we can use the heater. In this case, we can like adjust the frequency that we're stimulating it at and get a much more like actively kind of adjustable and tunable response profile. In this case, we can actually just increase the density of our actual like receptors to such a degree that we start to like kind of bypass those. Like we don't like, if you can actually diversify things really efficiently on small scale this way, like the limit here is that like it's hard to make a bunch of different types of nanoparticles that have distinctive enough, like, I mean, it's not actually hard, but like to manufacture it, in this case, like 300 micron little dots in a repeatable way is hard. But there, like the principle here is that we've just increased the density so much that we're kind of like leaning more towards the side of the HPLC, like just reference levels of like a large array of compounds. And so like more generally, this kind of, I feel like, speaks to a tension and like how there are two different styles of kind of olfaction research, I guess, and object classification. I feel like they're compatible. Well, I'll get to this. This is yapping. I'll get to this in a second. Carbon nanotube, another similarly dense and kind of promising one. You can grow carbon nanotubes and dope them in such a way that they are, again, like selective to different sets of gases, and you can like really efficiently, you can modify like the response on a really small scale. Like you can create a really high density, highly diversified array really easily just because of how the chemical process works. This one's harder, but can give some good sensitivity. The capacitive microsheen ultrasonic transducer array, similar principle to the Sol resonator, which is that you have little coatings on the surface of this little, like micro machined capacitor that will bind to particles in the air and affect the dielectric constant of the coating between the plates, and then that will let you measure the binding to that specific coating. So like I guess like what I'm trying to say is like in the amperometric case, we can imagine that just like the composition of the electrolyte, we're kind of baking in the sensitivity in the same way that like a given receptor will like individuate into a given receptor type that has a specific response profile. And a given organism will like, as they, grow up, just kind of grow this array. And we're specifying individual sensors kind of similarly. But we would really like to be able to kind of dynamically tune them so that we can kind of sweep through different profiles instead of having to have such a high density, or maybe not. Maybe it is actually easier because of particularly these two and Selig channels, which I actually don't think I have, but this is another promising one. Like kind of the two possible solutions are you can narrow down like what are the neighborhoods of compounds that are the most relevant to different scent neighborhoods. And like I'm going to kind of get esoteric here, but we can imagine that like we can classify and say like flies. like the specific responses of different groups of olfactory neurons and the different like ranges of response profiles that are expressed. And we like know the ecological cues of significance that kind of scent objects of significance to them, which are kind of interior to their little particular scent world, which is nominated by like their combination of scent. Like, and when I say their scent world, the distinction here is that like objects in scent space, the separability of different classes of objects depends on the sensor apparatus and diversity of that sensor apparatus. Like the actual, like the degree of separability of classes of scents, like within the range of fruits, can be like more or less attuned by the specific chemical affinities of the sensors that the organism's using. So like when we talk about like scent universes as opposed to like chemical analysis, it has like, I feel like we have to kind of reflect that we're talking about that. And like one way to try to solve this is to like, there's a database called FoodDB where it's just like a list of all of the compounds that readily diffuse into the air. And they're like relative levels in every, you know, more or less every food. And that's like one strategy where you basically have a way of mapping the response of the sensor array to the like compound like occurrence in different objects, and then you try to find patterns in like the occurrence of things and like make sensors that are good for specific types of objects, and then maybe expand that. Or you kind of like the constructive learning process where you delineate specific events and then organize a specific sensor with some kind of tunable profile to like maximize the discernibility of that one given event, or like the separability with respect to background. Like the Bosch AI Studio doesn't really give you a good way to kind of tune the resilience versus, or like the variety of different scent objects it can capture versus resilience. Like the way that they kind of tell you to deal with this indirectly is like the amount of noise in the training data will more or less correspond to the like kind of resilience of the scent detection model that you load on. They're like, basically that's what we're trying to avoid, is we're trying to like, without just getting to the point of we're measuring like all the viable compounds to measure that are relevant, like how do we kind of align different scent events and different sensor apparatuses. So like the kind of biologically inspired way would be to like, and there's like ways of determining what groups of ligands are most relevant in the olfactory systems of given organisms. And so like we can imagine that like given sensors that smell a specific class of object probably benefit from like playing and like with the variability of response to the like that class of ligands. But like the alternative possible solution to like optimizing the actual like set of chemical affinities to the class of objects, which is kind of like what they're saying. Where did I put it? Back here. That like there's group identification from kind of emergently solving the chemical space like this, like to figure out what kind of response or what type of sensors kind of effectively differentiate classes of objects best. Like you can almost imagine like a sensor FPGA where you just have like such a high density of sensors that you can kind of just with like digital signal processing arbitrarily construct like olfactory receptors kind of through mixing an array of diversified sensors, and then like ideally tune those to kind of align with like model examples of given olfactory receptor neurons. So like we have a model of like the way that a fly's olfactory receptor neurons work. But anyways, last thing I'll talk about, scent synthesis. So like once you have a kind of, the problem here is like what array of chemical affinities and like that you can like kind of vary the response profile to in order to be able to like combine and extract sense information like is best suited to specific applications. Kind of intuitively, that's like the same problem of like what array of compounds best or are expandable into the most possible discernible like sense. So like a good perfumist presumably, and this isn't something that I can speak well to, it sounds like there's someone else who's better at this here, but like it sounds like a good, or being a good perfumist is basically being able to intuitively like have a sense of how combining things in this like high dimensional space that kind of represents like the combination of the different like underlying essential oils, like or I get like the high dimensional space vocabulary that you arrive at just in like describing the trading process of the enos kind of seems similar to the problem of like, how do I recreate a scent through combining 20 things that aren't intuitively like related to scent profiles that I can describe, like placing something like, or I guess like combining 15 different things to recreate like an imagined scent is kind of a similar profile or problem in reverse. So the idea is like you tune a sensor apparatus to maximize the separability of the classes of scents you would also like to synthesize, and then identifying the kind of like vectors that correspond to specific classes of scent, like shown here, kind of enables you to then make a good synthesis platform, because that kind of tells you what oils you want to be able to mix to efficiently recreate the widest neighborhood of scents. So these are just like the basic relevant mechanisms. Or like, okay, so this is like a scent diffusing mechanism. This is just like an ultrasonic one. You'll have like some way of moving a liquid onto an ultrasonic platform, vibrating it really fast. It aerosolizes and dissolves. You use microfluidics to use like say 20 channels of different oils that you can then mix and then put onto like either a macroscopic ultrasonic transducer or something called a SAW resonator. SAW resonator, pictured here, uses higher frequency and like surface waves on like very, very small kind of microstructure devices. It's much better at like very low quantities of liquid, like, and this is something that's tested for like VR. Like you need a ridiculous RF power amplifier. Like there's a lot of disadvantages, but it allows you to diffuse like, you know, nanoliters in controllable way. Like, and this is also good because it'll diffuse much more easily. You would like to put something close to someone's face for an olfactory display and not have like, you know, lingering scents in a room from having to pump out a bunch to have it be detectable. And the other thing is the nose does like, there's a spatial dimension to olfactory sensing. I think they have a slide on this somewhere back here, but I'm trying to keep it short. But so like, it does actually matter, like, you need to be able to also induce flow in a specific way that emulates like kind of the natural, like, I guess like mechanics of scent dispersing in the air. So you need to like have a way to capture the scent that comes off the SAW diffuser and then pump it in kind of a control, not really laminar, but like quasi-laminar flow towards the nose. And that will like minimize the amount of scent you have to disperse and then kind of allow you to continuously pump in artificial scents without accumulating like a gross, you know, sickly synthetic smell.
So I'm going to be talking a bit more about like the individual differences between how people perceive olfaction and how that fits into like the idea of a scent engine. So smell is basically the last sense that hasn't been properly digitized. So like we have screens for vision, speakers for audio, but there's nothing reliable for scent. And one of the reasons is how different it is between like individuals. And so the goal here is to walk through like how what it would take to build a system which is reliable for large populations. So to start with something concrete, like you saw on the previous slide, 14% of people think that cilantro tastes like soap. And that comes down to a single nucleotide polymorphism. Basically, there's a 1-letter difference in your DNA near a receptor called OR6A2. And you have like 2 groups of people who are living in completely different sensory realities because of that one base pair. And it's actually like a perfect example of why building a universal scent engine is tricky. Because I think like Lucy mentioned earlier, there isn't like a single spectrum like light to go off of. And your receptors react to specific molecules in different ways. And so humans have about 400 working smell receptors, and the kicker is that more than 40% of these have more than 40% of these genes have like common variants that actually change how the protein works. And so there's like a great example with OR7D4 that flips like depending on which version you have, androstenone smells either like vanilla or like a barnyard, and that's pretty flippy. So like yeah, there are many examples of this across all of the different variants, and so this means that any scent engine needs to calibrate to each specific user. So I'm thinking something like a smell captcha, where you sniff a bunch of reference tests, and so the system learns how your particular like nose maps chemicals to perceptions. But it's not just genetics. Your culture actually matters a lot too. English speakers, for example, are terrible at describing smells. So we have like around 20 dedicated smell words, and we end up saying things like smells like a dentist's office anyways, because it's just not enough to describe smell in like to a level of accuracy that it deserves.
By the way,
but
Trish, does this
yeah.
tie into the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis at all?
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but then there's this language called Jahai, which is it originates in Malaysia, and they have over 50 dedicated odor terms, and they can like name smells as quickly as they name colors, which is really interesting because of like the different because of the much larger odor vocabulary. And so if we built our interface around English, like smell vocabulary, we'd be handicapping the system completely. And so a better approach would just be to let users like define their own descriptors. And then we use machine learning to align these personal vocabularies with the underlying chemical space, because that's a lot more reliable. There's also this like really interesting thing where 4% of people automatically see colors when they smell things. And it's a form of synesthesia called odor color synesthesia. And brain imaging actually shows that there are like neural connections between the smell processing areas and color processing areas, which result in this condition. And it gives us an actual design opportunity, in my opinion. Like if our scent engine can show color previews of smell blends, synesthetes can get like, they can get immediate feedback. And so everyone else just gets an extra memory cue. But for people who experience synesthesia this way, it would be really interesting to see how well it maps. So it's like having like a visual mixer interface for smell. And like speaking of, there was this really cool experiment that Yoya and I got to do. There's a model which Google will be like releasing soon for real-time, music. But if you enter like chemical names, and you can enter multiple, the way that it changes the music was really interesting. Like there's some sort of mapping going on. And we were joking about like making like chemical reactions using music. So that was pretty funny. So now let's think about how smells actually work. I like to think about it like language because I've been into linguistics most of my life. So you have these like basic chemical building blocks. You have thiols that smell skunky, esters that smell fruity, indoles that smell like kind of like horsey, I guess. And those are just like phonemes. So when you combine them, you don't just get like additive effects. You also get emergent properties from them. So 3 or 4 chemicals together might create a rose smell that's completely different from like the sum of its parts. And so those combinations are like morphemes in language. And just like in language, some of the combinations work and others don't. And there's an actual pattern to this where like some smell blends will smell like grammatical, so to speak, or fluent, and others will smell extremely chaotic. And so there are like actual rules to how they work. So sweet ester notes will usually dominate like green herbal ones, but only if you have something like vanillin to anchor the blend. And I'm not entirely familiar with this because I've not looked into perfumery a lot, but yeah, the like math behind the actual like latent space is really interesting. So with 400 receptors that can be either on or off, you theoretically have 10 to the 12th power distinguishable smell patterns. And it's just like where in human language gets by with about 40 phonemes, we probably don't need all of those combinations. And so the goal would be to find maybe like 10,000 or so. I'm just picking an arbitrary like number here, but like core smell chords that cover the perceptual space like efficiently. So essentially trying to build like our own IPA, but for smell. This is like a theoretical engine architecture that I try to think of. So the I'm theorizing that there are 4 main components. Starting off with the sensors that Lucy talked about that convert like chemical signatures into high-dimensional vectors. And second, we have a latent mapping space which takes those vectors and maps them into a learned smell space, because we need like personal calibration for each user, meaning that we can't just map it to the same space every single time without like a pre-processing step. And after that, we have a compiler which figures out the actual like microfluidic recipe for what chemicals to mix and like what proportions to hit like a specific target point in the smell space. And finally, we'd have a diffuser, which Lucy also covered. And it needs to release the scent with like precise timing for real-time applications. So the reason for that is Lucy mentioned like there's a spatial side to olfaction, and time plays a big role in that. Like you can sense how recent or stale a smell is, and so it's extremely interesting to like figure out exactly how a smell has to be diffused. So yeah, the like end goal would be something like you can prompt a smell into existence essentially. And the system would just understand what you mean. It would compile like a recipe and produce that smell. So basically a text-to-smell model, which would be really, really interesting to see in practice. We're not there yet, but like the components are starting to exist and get better every day. So yeah. So these are just kind of the takeaways from everything I mentioned. So like everybody knows this is Snowflake. It's completely unique, and it's every single person experiences smell differently at a genetic and cultural level. Second is the fact that we have to understand the compositional rules of smell to make this tractable. Like it's not like just individual components or molecules, but also how they combine in different ways, and how our receptors react to them. And there's also the fact that we need to have a pretty clear idea of what the stack would look like hardware and software wise, because we're not quite there yet. Like there are many different approaches we can take, and there isn't a single like one of them which seems entirely optimal. So it's kind of like specific to the usage or implementation, or even in some cases like the user's preferences. So yeah, and these are kind of just like references and further reading that I found really interesting that were related. Yo-Yo also mentioned like the Google paper. That one was really great. I also got kind of invested like going through Nomad. It's a really fun site, and yeah, they have some like great visualizations of genetic variants. Yeah, that's it from me. Thanks.
Awesome. Super cool. All of, I'd say all three of you are some pretty smart, creative people, right? So the first question that I would have is, why this? Of all the things you could be thinking about and studying, what is interesting and special enough about this where you felt this was worth tackling?
Well, I was going to suggest that it seems like it seems like there is a lot of data that is existing about sense that you can create new theories about it. And it seems like pre-paradigm or early normal science that you can just
I'd say that's fair. Yeah.
You can, the field can like change.
My life has been a series of events where I tried to build things that existed in Ready Player One.
Nice.
And so this is yet another one of them.
Can you remind me what is the send component in Ready Player One? Is it just the VR integration with VR haptics?
Yeah. There's like there's a time where Wade makes like enough money to get like a really expensive setup, and so he gets like the best like smell tower on the market, and it's really interesting to like think about that. Yeah.
I feel like olfaction is just so underrated. Like it's the amount of information that you're like, I underrate olfaction in my own life. Like I feel like I often find myself like kind of paranoid. I have snakes, and snakes are very like sensitive to smells. So if I like have perfume in my room too close to them, I will like notice that they're kind of freaked out and stuff. And I just like I guess like think a lot about like animals that have where so much of their world is scent, and how like crazy it is that you can detect such minute levels of, and like there's a spatial component that's so interesting. There's so many interesting ecological surveying implementations that seem so like readily possible. Like some of the big implementations of this tech that already exist are like wildfire monitoring, and you can imagine really naturally extending that to like, monitoring pollen transfer over wide areas or all kinds of other cool stuff. And it just is so sad to me that no one is interested in olfaction. And I feel like it's kind of intuitive why, because it's so like difficult to motivate and generalize, I guess, compared to other like sensing modalities. Like I guess like the analogy I think about is like you can map any two given like, microphones or image sensors response profiles to each other with respect to like an objective underlying range, but because of like how kind of combinatorial and like constructive scent events are, it just seems like it is both so powerful and like undervalued.
Also, when I was looking through scent databases, they all seem like to be from the early 2000s or 2010s. I guess maybe one thing is because those databases are out of fashion, you no longer manually collect data, but use machine learning like models to process them, and then the databases become proprietary and not shared.
Well, I think something really interesting, right, about this olfaction thing in general, but I mean the whole field of it, right, is that I think we're sort of in the minority about being able to use our vision in the way that we are, and everything is so sort of very vision based in our kind of age of information, right? But there's also different kinds of information that don't involve vision, and that might very well be what a lot of the planet uses, right? I mean, if you look at most animals, how do they'll use their mouth for things, for taste and texture. They'll be using their nose. I mean, definitely, eyesight and hearing to an extent for sure. But, a lot of like the very direct physical interface that people will have is through smell or like taste and touch. And I think it's sort of, to your point, I think it's a shame that there hasn't been nearly enough exploration into the field of olfaction as maybe there could have been. Something I would think about, right, is that if you had a human, now I'm not saying we're going to be able to run this experiment for a variety of reasons, but let's just say hypothetically you did have a human and you basically muted all your other senses, right? The only sense that they really had that they could really utilize was, say, their sense of smell. What way would that change their cognition in the way that they thought about things, the languages that they created, right? The ways of coordinating with other, humans, at least in their system. But, maybe you could say if there was a human sort of from birth raised and trained on olfaction, potentially at the expense of other senses, would they maybe even find it easier to communicate with other organisms that aren't humans? Right? Like, have you ever tried to communicate like really specifically to a dog or a cat or certain birds, or even, to be fair, even to like small children and toddlers? Like, that's not tough, or that's not easy sometimes, right? And then of course you sort of have the neurodiversity of humans in and of itself, and there's such a wide variety of humans and the way that their minds can work. And I don't know, I'm interested in about like what the thought experiment, what if you had a child that was strictly raised on olfaction at the expense of other senses? Like, what type of language would evolve out of that? What type of, way would they think and abstract, compress information, stuff like that?
Isn't that kind of what Helen Keller had, except she also had the sense of touch? And she described it as though she was a wild animal before she learned how to do language and communicate her emotional needs.
Yeah.
I think she still had language, she just couldn't communicate. Like, she describes having an internal language in her memoirs, just not one that was like expressible. But
closer to
tick
that.
markings.
Closer to that of an animal, like more connected between the wants and actions, I think it was. I'd have to look it up, the exact quote.
I like Uxkol, or I don't know, there's a book recently that kind of is a neo-Uxkolian biology book called An Immense World by Ed Young. And there was this description of how the shrimp, like the mantis shrimp has this weird compound eye that is sensitive to like circular polarization, and they also have like circularly polarized spots on their body, and there was kind of like a chicken and the egg problem in that. And like the really good line is like, beauty is not only in the eye of the beholder but arises because of that eye, that he says on this, where it's like, does the mantis shrimp develop like ways of signaling through circular polarization after it has the compound eye, or does it develop the compound eye because there are like events that are relevant? Well, kind of both, and it doesn't really matter. It's like the effect loop that is relevant. And so with like scent events, like there are certain ways in which the actual underlying chemical affinities shape like the susceptibility and kind of discernibility and separability of different categories of potential scent objects or whatever, right? So there are like underlying chemical like compounds that diffuse that like there's some full set of them, you can measure some like number of them to a greater degree of sensitivity or lesser degree. That's not really the platform that you're directly used. Like, your brain doesn't have like a database of like what's the level of this and this and this in each thing. It's like memorizing the like activation pattern like through multiple layers of after the actual olfactory neuron responses, there's like the diversity of different responses that like in the kind of combat, like the processing, the difference between the different responses is where like the actual learning takes place. And then like after you're repeatedly exposed to something, it can get like more and more easy to recognize it. But there are also situations where things just kind of have like the need for an instinctive, intuitive understanding of a given scent event, and it should just trigger a certain like biological response directly, like like mating pheromones for moths. And in those cases, there are like olfactory neurons that are just like only really tuned to that. So I guess like what this points to is that like the diversity of the receptors that a given organism grows kind of like tunes the shape of their olfactory world in a way that is kind of well suited to their mode of life.
I would expect there to be like physical limits of how fast scent information can travel, and communication would generally be slower. And I'm not sure if scent is strictly sequential data or not. And also, yeah, like combinatorial activations. So multiple messages can be communicated at once. And also like human pheromones, probably because we use other modalities to communicate, it seems like pheromones have inconsistent responses, at least in studies in humans.
I actually wanted to tie back into what Shresh was talking about with the Jahai language, I think is what you said it was, the Malaysian. So remember I was sort of talking about the Sapir-Whorf thing, right? And it's interesting about, what are the things that how do you use something if you can't think about it or describe it, right? And I mean, this is the more I'm sort of looking into this, right? I mean, it's interesting that you're using, when I'm describing a scent, an odor, something olfactory to you, I'm not actually using olfaction to do that. I'm using another sensory modality to do that, right? And so the interesting thing about a kind of olfactory based language, and again, I'm just saying that because that's my, perspective on things, but is that you can use, smell to talk about smell itself. Right, like I can use audio to describe audio, vision to describe vision, but smell, like a lot of the time, we're sort of left about using all these other less direct ways of describing it. And I'm curious about like, why is it that's okay? I think there's a couple ways to phrase this. First thing is are there advantages to not utilizing olfaction? Right, we'll play devil's advocate for a second. Are there benefits not utilizing olfaction? We'll first say that, and then the second thing is that if someone had to pick and choose between senses for certain tasks, why would they prefer olfaction over another one? Like what problem would you have to be solving where it's so beneficial to be using olfaction over, say vision or hearing or touch, right? Because we seem to get by pretty well on vision and all that these days as humans, but there could very likely be a set of important problems that would be much better solved through olfaction than through other senses.
You're digging in the coal mines and you want to see if it's fresh, or if you smell coal in there, or something they should get out of the mine.
I have an answer, but sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Lucy.
Well, I mean, like there's some tasks where you want to measure the reference or like the level of some specific compound to, if you're doing like ELISA assay testing or something, there's some very specific protein that you want to bind to and measure the level of or something. Like then with like, or how, I guess I should say it like this. If you have a diagnostic method that depends on defining a specific level that like directly corresponds to like the, positive or negative you have a virus, or like this is how good or bad this, how old this thing is or how pure it is. It's very difficult to build a platform that is like, or I guess you can do that relatively easy by sensing the one direct thing and all kinds of other ways. Like if you're establishing that one kind of, well, like with olfaction, any given olfactory system, you kind of have to tune on site. You're looking at indirect markers. It's like annoying to kind of actively maintain. You have to be able to clearly discern the event. You're not like describing, this is some indicator that I'm measuring and I can use this piece of equipment or this piece of equipment and freely swap them and just measure this level. You're describing a kind of like
ignoring utility as well. There's the fact that yes, you can use like language and vision to communicate certain things, but I think when it comes to food, it's like pretty much undisputed that smell is the primary way we associate like their like we associate food with smells more than anything else.
And yet there can be things that in one sensory modality are very pleasant, and then in another, they aren't. I think it's the durian fruit that's like this. I think it just smells absolutely horrible, but apparently it tastes very good, right? Which again is interesting because you only would kind of know that beforehand if you had different ways of sensing this, right? If your only indicator of that fruit in particular and that potential source of nutrition and calories or whatever is going to be the smell, well, you're going to be warded off from ever going near that thing. But there's something else that actually lets you utilize that, so that's letting you, be receptive to that, which is, again, interesting in and of itself. But, for me, it's, I think the food thing about, I think in kind of the modern world, we forget how important olfaction might have been for making sure we don't eat food that would kill us. Right. And I think, this also very likely played a role in the sort of, I say that fermentation was like proto-chemistry in a sense, right? It was chemistry before it was chemistry. And, certain fermenting processes will have certain kind of olfactory properties, right? If you smell certain alcohol, certain fermented, yes, we're not eating the wrong food. Yeah, Jess agrees on that. By the way, Jess, feel free to hop in if you have any ideas or comments. But no, I think about even just like if you've left food out or it's in the fridge or like a lot of times, like sometimes you can't actually tell visually, but you have an alternate sensory modality that lets you still access the information that you're trying to get. Again, because it's interesting that why is it that we have different senses and not, the ones that we have now versus, other things that they could be. And I do think that like, it's sort of, from that framework, it clicks about why there are a lot of organisms that are pretty, they'll always try to leverage olfaction and smell, right? Just look at dogs, for instance, right? I always found it interesting. We were talking about this where it's like, actually it was someone in Boston, but he was saying, it's interesting that like, if you go to the airport or whatever, right? We have this really good technology for visual information, for audio, but what do we use for smell? Well, we use dogs a lot of the time. The police also use dogs as well, right? And it's interesting that we have all these other higher, supposedly higher forms of technology for all these other sensory modalities, but olfaction is still very much, dogs, right? An AI dog, a digital dog could be a very interesting thing to try to make. But I am curious about what would have made olfaction evolve, because I think if we look at the way olfaction evolved, that could also tell us what to do from like a computational perspective about creating, more advanced forms of like AIs that rely on olfaction. Right? Because for me, I think if I were to go the AI, route for olfaction, it would be like, how can you create, a super powered AI olfactory dog? Like one that has, the ability of a normal trained dog on steroids or something, right? What do you think is the reason that olfaction would have actually evolved as a sense to begin with? Where would that have sort of come from in the lineage of biology?
Being able to tell if food's edible or not, poisonous, or smelling threats or mates.
And also food sensing at a distance, aside from indirect contact.
I think it's also important to mention the size of the organism. Right, I think olfaction serves different purposes if you're a very, very small organism, right, versus if you're much larger, right? So I think one of the benefits of say being a dog is that you're much more closer to the ground, or if you're out in the wild, the grass and the dirt and all this kind of stuff, and you're going to have a much more richer olfactory world, probably than being in some sort of sealed up house kind of thing. Jess says olfaction has a different take on vibe sensing temporally and proximity working at different levels. Yeah, but see, that's the thing about, what I was talking with, actually this was Eliade just yesterday about, the not necessarily an olfactory, the map of all possible ways of using olfaction, but the map of all possible senses, right? Because what I'd be interested in is right now we're honed in on olfaction, which is super, super cool. But what else could that lead to that we don't know about yet? I'm very interested, and I know Jess and Cooper and many people who return on the podcast are, but how does a new kind of sense evolve? Right? What is something you could see olfaction potentially evolving into in the future? Right? Yeah, what other stuff could be in the perceptual manifold? Yeah, just as Cooper said.
There's like an interesting variety problem that olfaction solves in its own like interesting way, where like I guess like the selection of chemical affinities dominating the scent universe of significance,
right,
like in different insects, like for ants that are very social, like by way of pheromones, they have like a set of olfactory receptor neurons that do much better differentiating the different like basic like pheromone social units compared to like the much more like, I guess, like general purpose. Like this is what I mean is the selectivity of a given molecule to something like a pheromone versus a very general purpose cross-sensitive VOC sensor, like is kind of speaking to this variety problem embedded in scent. And like, how do you overcome like aligning different, like, or I guess like the utility of scent versus just like measuring levels of whatever the underlying chemicals are, is that it solves this variety problem more efficiently by indirectly measuring like, you know, these like differences in like the variable response to an array of things, and then being able to tune to like maximize the discernibility of different things. Like that, the way that you like kind of make that more resilient and less susceptible to like noise, and the way that it uniquely is because of how it's like, you know, a constructive machine learning process versus like objectively measuring reference levels or something, is like either you map like the underlying possible like differences in response profiles and figure out how to like dynamically tune through those to like essentially map olfactory space. So you would be like figuring out what are the different possible types of olfactory like receptor response profiles, and how can I emulate each of them and then kind of artificially recreate the olfactory world of a given organism. Or you use like heterogeneous sensor architectures to kind of like figure out underlying chemicals of significance that map like groups of scents in a way that you can like kind of select scent worlds in that way and kind of like map to like groups of chemical affinities. I guess I don't understand chemistry enough to understand how this one works, but it was explained to me in a way that was compelling. Where like possibly there's like neighborhoods of scent that intuitively do map, just not necessarily like in the same way that like taste has intuitive parameters, but like I think this is something that you were speaking to earlier, actually. But I digress. And I feel like that kind of gives you the vocabulary to imagine like other kind of novel heterogeneous forms of sensing that you kind of assemble in just like the differential analysis of like an array of different sensors, if that makes sense.
No, I thought your answer was quite good. The thing that I'm sort of thinking about, right? So back to sort of the basis of where you want to go with this project. About, you know, what will this sort of, what do you think this whole kind of idea of a universal scent engine, what do you think? I know Yo-Yo and Lucy spoke about it a little bit also in the previous presentation almost a month ago now or something, but you know, what are the kind of very practical use cases like that you would have in the current environment, but then also some of the more futuristic ones about where this could actually lead. And I think you're going to actually have a lot to explore on that because it's so understudied, and there's just so much more we could probably do with this.
I think a lot of the food robots could be considered universal scent engines, but in a more embodied way. And then you can study, like, for each particular food, the different compositions of that food in the engine. And for example, if you are making kimchi, you can add different levels of yeast into it. And then it also relates to synthesizing medicine, but that is like quite a far.
Yeah, so I'm curious about the number of different olfactory cells that we have in the human olfactory system versus animals, if there's like a metric difference on that.
Insects have like dozens to hundreds, humans have like hundreds to thousands, depending on how you classify it. Like it actually is individually, like, or I guess like it's the gene expression person to person, but like in an individual person, it's there's a number, like a few hundred basic types that will be expressed in different places to different degrees.
Okay, so like in humans, there might be a total of 1,000 different things across the whole race. I mean, species, but
different
each
types of
individual
olfactory.
have a certain subset of that. Okay, and then but the next question is, has like Neuralink, for instance, or is there a way to get readings on the individual receptor profiles given a stimulus?
Yeah, you can map out like what the chemical affinities are and response profiles of individual sensors. And so this is kind of one of the ways you can imagine like general, like kind of mapping between like embodied scent worlds is like you figure out what the actual like response profiles of a given receptor type are to different like chemicals, this has been done. Like this is the labeled line sorting where they find like there are specific chemicals that you can like add or remove to a scene, like a flower, that trigger the same set of olfactory receptor neurons that are associated with like, like detecting whether or not to oviposit and like narrow down what actual ligands are responsible for activating different olfactory neurons in different amounts. And now there's like actual like models of like like olfactory neurons and like activation models that like pretty extensively map like what different chemicals do specifically and how it propagates through their brain.
Okay.
Yes. And specific
then-
to the olfactory bulb, there's like this electrobulbogram technique. It seems to be just like EEG electrodes placed on the nasal bridge. Not intrusive either.
Oh, okay. Well, that's for sensing the responses?
Yes, in the nose.
Uh-huh.
So I know that for like optic stuff, like a single like wavelength can trigger like several different cones, and then those several cones will like activate in like to varying degrees in a non-linear fashion. And then that'll get sent to the brain and further interacted with another non-linear way, which we don't really perfectly understand yet. It seems to me that this color sensing stuff, like at least in like animals such as us, is likely to be like equally non-linear, and therefore I have to like wonder what if you were to take all the like scents that like or like scent detecting like separate different scent detecting like cells, I guess. I'm not cells isn't the right word. You can imagine it's like a multi-dimensional, a hyperdimensional vector, as like you've stated before. And there's probably going to be like nearby scents that you have to like humans would have like difficulty like differentiating between. You could think that in this higher dimensional space, there's a metric tensor which tells you the distance between different scents. And I'm kind of wondering, how would you find this like metric tensor of like the scent metric tensor, I guess?
Yeah, like different chemical affinities kind of maximize the separability of different scent vectors more or less effectively. And that's kind of what I guess I'm trying to say with the different olfactory neurons will have different chemical response profiles depending on the gene expression, but also like a given insect, like the range of underlying VOCs it scents will be like probably related to the fruits that it finds palatable or something, right? Like the actual like whatever the difference is in that individual fruit that make it like its chemical fingerprint. There are some things that both like readily diffuse and are relatively easy for like biological olfactory receptors to pick up on, and those are the things that the thing that is like trying to detect that will probably like its neurons will like be tuned to maximize the discernibility of that in the high dimensional space that you can kind of imagine downstream of the activation patterns from the given olfactory receptors. This is kind of related to like the solving the variety reduction problem. I just linked 2 papers in chat, like the neuromorphic olfactory learning is a good one.
Because you have a sensor that can sense things beyond what the humans can sense, right? So what other sort of conceptual things can we feed into ourselves? Neosensory, a company that does sensory substitution for audio to haptics, they have like 70 things in the works. And one of those is a gas sensor that will translate certain chemical compounds from explosives into an actual sensation over vibratory patterns. And because we don't see reality as it is versus mediated through a whole storm of interplay, we actually can gain direct perception of these, even not over olfactory. We gain a lens into an olfactory landscape conceptually. So what sort of things do you think could be possible via that?
Yeah, I mean, if you are accessing things that are not, one way to look at this is one way. If you're accessing something that you normally can't access, how do you sort of interpret that and make sense of it? So one of the things I've spoken about before is like, do humans have some form of like magnetoreception, right? So the ability to sort of sense magnetism. Now, I do think, and Michael Ostroff, I think we also spoke about this before as well. I do think there is some sort of rough idea that some humans might be able to do this. Potentially all humans. I'm not really sure, but I would imagine that, like, if you just gave somebody right now who sort of had no basis for understanding, the sort of quality of what magnetism feels like, and you were to just give that to them, would they even be able to make sense of it? And so what you were saying earlier in the comments about sort of how the concepts are shaping what can be perceived, I think it's not just necessarily enough to have another, sensory interface modality plugged in, but there needs to be a way for the mind to be able to actually interpret that information, right? And this would also be about, like, building a multi-sensory computer, right? Because I think it'd be really interesting from a robotics perspective. You not only have vision and hearing, but now you're also going to have olfaction. And, is there some way that, when you are doing something, you are kind of, I talk a lot about coordination. You're coordinating between different sensory modalities, different ways of interfacing with the world. I mean, the food thing was a really good example about, if one thing isn't really working, right, you want to get this food, but, from a visual perspective, it's like, oh yeah, this looks fine. But from an olfactory perspective, you might be like, oh shit, I don't want to have that. That's going to kill me, right? The question then is, in sort of a weird meta sense, is what actually makes you ask the question that you should be using another sense to look at this, right? Because, on one hand, you might be like, oh, well, if you're, a younger child and you're doing this all for the first time, like, who's to say why you would say, use olfaction to scan information about the food versus, the other senses that you have, right? And so then now this also goes into the way we make decisions about the way that we use senses. And I think this could be a very, very interesting thing for what three of you are doing about, building this sort of universal scent engine that could then maybe scale into other sensory modalities. But it's like, what are the constraints that forces olfaction to be the most useful and interpret it in the right way? Because is there something sort of implicit in the smell itself? And I know you sort of talked about this before. Is there something implicit in a bad smell versus something that's a good smell? Or could you just create conditions and associations with either or that could go in a million different directions? I actually want to hear from the three of you and Cooper on this one, because I think all of you will have something cool to say.
I think it's a combination of like the amount of chaos with regard to like what makes a good or bad smell. For the most part, that's usually what it is, but it's also the evolution of like receptors being trained to avoid bad smells because, like you said, food that is either poisonous or not nutritious to us. And so it's that. And I also think like being able to pick like like making the decision to pick a different modality to understand like an environment kind of depends on whether you've gauged like the amount of information that you've gathered is enough or not. For instance, like if we're talking about food, since like we come in with the knowledge that some food is some food tastes good, but once you're eating it, it's kind of a pain to like spit it out. So if you can gauge that just by smelling it, it's an advantage. And yeah, I also think when it comes to like memory augmentation, because Yo-Yo was talking about it in the chat, pinning like memories to a lot of different senses is has always been like a great method for improving recall. Just because you're storing it in multiple modalities, so you have a larger surface area for recovering information. So I think the fact that we use multiple senses is it's just one of the ways that we increase our surface area for both sensing like threats and advantages to us, like in an evolutionary perspective, but also the fact that we can remember situations using the modality that's best suited to it.
Right. And actually, that could be a good way to connect to what Cooper was saying in the comments about people who had a loss of smell from COVID or something like that. Right. Cooper, if you want to chime in on that one.
Yeah, well, that was more to the like what the neosensory does, or the sensory weaving stuff I do, to basically feed one modality in over an existing modality that we do have access to through patterns of meaning, like with wet and depthness and all that, or wet and depth and like time and all these senses. They are not directly from one single sense, but they are critical to our model of reality. So in that way, what is being added to our model of reality from smell that we may not necessarily conceptualize as directly from smell, but rather combined with the other senses to build a different kind of pseudo sense in a way. I don't know what the term for those things are, but I don't know. It seems interesting, the space of possible combinations as well as the conceptual interplay. Like, could we Pavlov ourselves into thinking a bad smell, like statistically, is actually good by associating good concepts with it? Like, how much of this is malleable?
Yeah, and this again also ties into the thing Yo-Yo was saying about the scent to memory augmentation as well, because I think it's not as easy to say that there is a good or bad memory and association. It sort of depends on what it is that you're going for, right? You know, if when you associate that feeling that touching the stove is going to hurt you, like that's probably a good association, right? But you know, let's just say you have some different, you gain some different through training, whatever, you get some kind of robustness to, hot temperatures or whatever, right? And normally something that would have caused you distress is no longer actually going to cause you distress, and you can gain something out of that system. Now that's no longer as advantageous. And so there is also something to establishing the flexibility of these things. But what I wanted to ask Trush is, what are some, in your own personal ways, what are some ways that you've noticed that olfaction has like played a role in like memory, right? Because I know in my life, there's even before I started taking all the olfactory stuff as seriously, like I still know that like there would be sometimes just these seemingly random distinct smells that would just trigger a very strong memory, right?
Yeah, so for me, I used to live in Paris when I was like very young, so like my memories of it are like kind of scattered. I was there for like a little bit during kindergarten and up until like second grade. And at the time, my mom was training as a pastry chef. And so like tons of the memories that I personally remember are associated with like the things that she would have made on that day, stuff like that. So like associations like that, like there, because that was something that she would do extremely often. Nearly all of my memories from Paris are tied to like the smell of the food that she would have made that day. Apart from that, I also think like oh yeah, when I was talking about Ready Player One, I had a brief like obsession with like diffusers. So there was a Muji like nearby where I lived, and I'd spend like an hour there just like trying out all of the diffusers. And I kind of feel like the book is stuck in my head a lot more because of just, trying to experience all of those. So this is unrelated to olfaction, but it's also the fact that I got at least 400 or 500 like song recommendations out of that book.
Yeah.
And so I feel like all of these, associations, while like in terms of, if you're looking at it from like a utilitarian perspective, it's not as useful as most of our other senses. But it definitely is important for memory in a way that the other senses can't really convey accurately. So yeah.
I guess it's also like in terms of the utility, like I personally like have to actively like make myself like use my sense of smell. Like I guess like I stopped during COVID having a sense of smell, and I don't even like, part of it was definitely I got COVID, but also like the variety of my world like dropped off for like a year and a half where I was just inside a tiny apartment all the time, and my I feel like we're talking so much about like the discernibility of specific scent objects and like the relative efficacy of, like indirect versus direct measurement. I think that's kind of beside the point. Like memory kind of like, it's like that Proust quote, like memory is a specific type of resonance that it gets attenuated, right? Like the quality of a scent event is like not like, I mean, like there's some species where scent is critical to like self-recognition, like snakes, for example. And you can imagine like how dynamic and kind of active their world is. They like, it's not like, it makes sense in their case that not only would it be like you imagine the scent kind of diffusing through the environment, dirt that they crawl along and spend a lot of time in that's like actively stirred up, they probably don't want to identify themselves there. They want to identify themselves at safe spaces that are stable and like, cool for them to hang out in, right? So like there's like a computation that's being done by the environment and the dispersion of scent that kind of they can use in like identifying kind of their home like through scent. And like if you like mess in their terrarium and like go under the place that they get really upset if you move like their hiding spots around for this reason, or if you move the dirt around under, because it's like, what's up now? Nothing is safe again, and I have to figure out how to be chill again. Like it reflects in their behavior. And like the kind of profound emotional significance that like whenever something has like hit me all of a sudden where it's like, oh, I recognize that, it's like all of a sudden it's there. Like it's not like I have I mean sometimes, but like even if it's just like a faint familiar scent, all of a sudden it becomes so strong because it's like my brain is activated. It kind of like I don't know how to explain the actual like efficacy of like the learning, I think kind of reflects like the cohesion of its like internal sense world, or like kind of wealth that is not really like expressible in terms of like the actual sensing resolution or relative efficacy. Like I kind of circled this with like the HPLC example, but like I do think like critically we have to differentiate between like scent computing and what's the best way to do indirect chemical analysis. Like there's a fundamentally like phenomenological kind of quality to scent where like the separability of different types of scent reflects like the nomination of what is important, either by like biological like affinity or by like memory and patterns of attention. And I guess like that's like what allows sensing like that. Like smell is both so useful and so sensitive and so difficult to utilize for this reason. Because like when you have something that can detect fuzzy events down to like parts per trillion in the, like in terms of composition in the air, it's like you have to be able to kind of lock on to things in a way that's hard. And like the difficulty of forming that association speaks to the way it's like embodied kind of experience that like the category of utility doesn't speak to very well, but I digress.
My personal experience with scent is that when I was a kid, I built a lot of bird nests, and then sometimes the bird nest will be blown away from the roof, so I would try to rescue it and place into the original spot, but I will obviously contaminate the nest, and then the bird mother, I think it was like some kind of robin, would abandon it.
I was also gonna say something interesting, right, to sort of tie some of this stuff in is things that change your sense of olfaction. Like one thing is first, like do we know anything about aging and olfaction? Right? Are there periods of life where olfaction is kind of the strongest, right? And then errors, I mean, I would probably have to assume as you get older, the effect, the strength of it is probably not the same as it used to be. But also, are there certain, compounds? We take a lot of things to enhance, visual acuity and hearing if we're sort of in a certain kind of stimulated state. Does that also have an effect on olfaction? People love taking things like Adderall. I wonder if that affects olfaction.
I used to smoke cigarettes all the time, and it made it impossible to smell anything. That was like one of the big benefits of quitting. And I feel like that, like,
Wait, so smoking cigarettes made it much harder to smell things?
destroyed my sense of smell because there was always one really strong smell stuck to me.
Right. But
You
so
get the
that
same
was the
effect, it's
smell
just
of it,
secondhand
not necessarily the
concept.
compound, but that was the smell of smoking.
hmm
Interesting. All right, sorry, Yo-Yo, you were going to say.
Yeah, if you live in a high pollution area, you get the same effect.
Right, that would make sense. What does weed do? Yeah, I mean that's I think you can ask this about multiple different kinds of compounds. Maybe we need somebody from QRI to hop in and give us some information on that. But it is something we're thinking about, are the ways that these different things will modify our olfactory acuity. And one of the things I think about is like, what is sort of the a lot of people, to be productive and do certain kinds of tasks, they will take things like THC or certain kinds of psychedelics, or if they want to be productive towards a certain task, they'll take caffeine and Adderall or whatever. What would be like the computational equivalent to that for like AI? Like, what is AI Adderall? Like, what kind of thing can you sort of inject into a computational system where you can get that kind of effect? Because this is why, like, the whole cybernetics thing and the way all these fields tie in together, I'm sure Jess has something to say about this, is really fascinating. Because for us, we have no problem saying that there's certain kinds of exactly prompts, inputs, whatever, that can very much change these things. So what is, Yo-Yo, a high energy prompt, prompts that that can change the way computers sense the environment?
Yeah, sometimes you put in an anchor like transmutation, translocation, transpilation, the combination into the language, and then the outputs will be in another attractor basin, I think. And then obviously compute resources.
I have actually a couple of things I could say on this. The first one would be how much, and again, this is polymath, so we have many different things that we'll talk about, right? But the first thing that comes to mind on this is the way that we also design. On the flip side, are there certain prompts that we design for computers that have a much more identifiable analog to humans, right? Because these are different kinds of minds, different kinds of brains in a sense. I mean, you could say, LLMs definitely have a similarity to the human brain for sure, right? And what kinds of prompts? I actually, one of my professors talks about this a lot. It's like prompt engineering for humans. You can prompt engineer computers, but that may also mean you can prompt engineer humans. What are things that we can do that changes the efficiency and the way that we interface with the program that's also applicable to humans? That's a very spicy subject. Yes, Cooper, this is.
I mean, that's the Socratic method in a nutshell. It's just prompt engineering humans.
There are ways of detecting olfactory events, like in an undirected way, where you don't necessarily just have to be like maximize the separability of this vector, like
Right.
given this training event. The difficult thing is that like utilizing that data is like if you can detect an olfactory event, the question is then how do you map it to whatever in the environment caused it, which gets to like like heterogeneous sensor arrays and ecological monitoring. Like if you have something that's set up to do wildfire detection, and you can also get it to detect other kinds of scents, and also get it to like detect olfactory events that it doesn't like, that don't clearly correlate with an event, can you like start to extrapolate what those events are? And probably. But it feels like it's hard to avoid, like, how do I say, the level of bias and the kind of like the sensor array that you're using to kind of model the environment, if that makes sense. But like there's a kind of planner's preference and what tools you set up to try to, like, probably any given event can be like represented in several different domains simultaneously, and if you like just try to like detect whatever event you can and then correlate them to whatever else. I don't know if that's necessarily useful.
Yeah, I didn't want to tie into what Shresh and I were saying earlier about the Sapir-Whorf thing, right? And it's like, I also think that's a kind of prompt engineering in a sense. I think that is a form of that. Because, you know, yeah, you're talking about this kind of thing, whatever it is, and you're not going to necessarily be able to utilize that if you can't say what it is, right? It's like, you know, it's easy for me to go and say, oh, something will happen, 2 days from now. Like, okay, thank you, that's very specific. It's not really that helpful. It's the specificity. It's sort of the do cult leaders use prompt engineering? Yes. Okay, we can get into sort of the idea of collective cognition and all these kinds of things, because it is interesting about, you know, I think cultures, I always say, you know, you can't spell culture without cult, right? I think that culture is very much a means of prompt engineering a large collection of minds and agents, right? And this also ties into this whole multi-agent thing that we have for AI about, you know, what kind of system prompts, you know, simultaneously prompts a bunch of different systems, you know, at the same time, right? You know, I talk about things like a sports team where, you know, you have one person going left, right, whoever else, they're doing physically different things, but it's contributing to the same goal. They're solving the same problem at the end of the day, even though they're doing very different things. If you have a company, right, you know, someone's sort of the sales guy, the technical guy, you have all these different roles. They're all physically doing different things, and yet it's contributing to the same goal. I also think that that's what senses are. They're doing all these physically different things, and yet that's contributing to some larger goal, right?
Yeah, like you can manipulate CO2 levels and all kinds of other, and you can like gene edit plants and adjust the palatability of them to specific species in order to like avoid contact between humans and specific insects. This is something that's being researched, and there's also all kinds of ways to like try to figure out what combinations of chemicals are most impactful on the behavior of specific like social insect colonies, both for like the sake of like studying the effects of different like environmental pollutants. So like some things like, and very heavily like, you know, like pheromone directed like social, like, you know, like ants and stuff, right? Like specific environmental pollutants like change their social behavior. And there's research into how to use this in positive ways and in like bioengineering ways to kind of offset some of the effects of environmental pollution. But
my Berkeley group house had multiple conversations on not showering pheromones and that part of olfactory stuff. You know, Ayla and all the other ideas in the meme plugs of that. I'd be very curious to find some real correlations or like even causations between something like how often does someone shower, how good, bad, how do they smell in general, and how attractive they are. I know this is not like exactly what like guys are doing, but like it's just I'm genuinely really interested in this. So any ideas?
I believe the ScentNet people are releasing a model in Hugging Face soon that will have human pheromone detection. You can find that paper. Actually, I don't know if the paper is public yet.
Well, yeah, it was more on the plant side. I'm just thinking of, we know plants communicate over VOCs to each other, like long distances. Like you have giraffes eating trees upwind of another plant, and it will then send signals to trees further downwind that will then turn their leaves bitter. Or you will have certain plants, if they are eaten by an insect, then send out chemicals like VOCs to call in hornets, which will then kill the things eating them. So I'm kind of wondering what other things we might be able to find out via just this sort of more exploratory looking at what sort of signaling already goes on, not just between animals and people, but also other things such as plants.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you know, on the plants thing, and you know, the relationship between the thing that is eaten and you know that is doing the eating and is being eating. You know, something interesting, right? Is that there's been nothing better for the survival of, you know, for increasing the species size, you know, the population of vegetables and fruits and animals and being delicious to humans, because we've just bred the heck out of them, right? being delicious to us and or nutritious to us, even though that's sometimes debatable, has been the best possible thing for not just, it's not the single unit. It's not the single apple. It's not the single carrot. It's not the single chicken. It's sort of the entire species, the collective of it, right? And for an interesting reason, you would think, oh, wouldn't a lot of plants or animals want to, develop these mechanisms of, repelling humans or its predators? And of course, this does happen. But, I think that quote about intelligence being, it's more about the goal rather than you're doing it one specific way. There's multiple different ways to reach the same kind of goal. I think that's an interesting thing where it's like, if your goal is kind of survival, you take one for the team each time you're eating or whatever, but you're saving the mass of it. And you're not just saving that, you're actually, in the long run, you end up growing it, incredibly large, right? Now, of course, we can talk about the way many animals are treated in farming practices, which is a whole nother thing to go down, but it is kind of biodiversity classical bird. Yes. Well, that's an interesting point, though. That's actually, I want, if you were curious to talk about that more, but how does that stuff affect biodiversity? Right? Because generally we would say biodiversity is thought of to be, a decent thing in many circumstances, but are there areas where you want more limited and restrictive homogeneous populations? I'm curious, Lucy.
In some areas, probably. Like I'm not a hater of all monoculture, but it does seem like the problem of kind of recklessly modifying wide ecologies to the extent that we have creates a lot of silent spring situations.
Right.
And there probably should be a lot better ways of getting insights into like this is, I guess, kind of back to this speaks to like why scent is underutilized and undervalued. Like so much of the animal world relies on scent to have like a kind of context and memory of their world, and having absolutely no curiosity to like understand and analyze like the world of scents in the same way that we do with, like geological surveying and all kinds of other, like weather surveying, whatever, that are useful to specific economic processes more directly. Like it seems like if we can have a language to capture scent and kind of scent vocabularies, that gives you so much insight into a kind of indirect, like very like almost poetic kind of vocabulary for sure, but like a vocabulary to describe dynamics of ecological systems in like an asubjective way. And that's really interesting to me, I guess. And this kind of speaks to like the broader motivation of like scent context. But like the total decimation of like agricultural and biodiversity in large areas like seems related to like the same phenomenon of like, I mean, like in me personally, like the decline in variety of my environment was like I was using my nose less and like, kind of lost the vocabulary to describe scents. And I feel like similarly, like not really being curious about or having any insight to the scent world of the areas, like even like around, like, there's all kinds of enclosed areas that aren't technically like being, ruined by specific, like, how would you say, like there's all of those different like pesticides that kind of spread over wide areas that is kind of like, who knows how far they're actually spreading was one of the things they talked about in Silent Spring. Like there isn't really even the vocabulary to measure how widely things like this just disperse to the environment, even though we know objectively that this significantly impacts the behavior of all kinds of insects and other animals.
Well, something I wanted to add, on the agriculture and farming thing, right, is also like from sort of at least the human perspective about the foods that we eat. We have no problem. I mean, if I were to ask you, would you rather eat a healthy animal or plant or an unhealthy animal or plant? I mean, you'd probably say the healthy animal or plant, but we don't have biohacking for plants and other animals per se, in the same way that we do for humans. And there have been many cultures and things throughout history about believing that it's generally beneficial to eat the healthier animal. I mean, you could say that's sort of the whole foods, organic, farm-based kind of movement on things, about things that, the ecosystem was less disrupted. And it's not that it's the disruption or the interference that's necessarily the issue in and of itself. It's more about it's just what you're doing to it, right? What you're specifically doing when you do the kind of interference that you're doing. And it's like, if you bred plants to be, healthier, animals to be healthier, would that also mean that we're healthier from eating them? Right. And something that also people don't think about from like a health perspective is that it's not enough to just say, if you look at the way, we'll look at the way the inputs and the outputs have evolved throughout evolution and history, right? It's the way the thing that's doing the eating and the thing that's being eaten and consumed, right? Is, there was a certain way that plants had to be, harvested and treated to be able to be digested and metabolized in a certain way. Same thing for animals. Like if you're hunting some, a deer or some game meat or whatever, like that's you're not just chilling. You're not just, driving or taking an Uber, taking Uber Eats to deliver the thing. No, there is an actual physical process that's coupled to the consumption of that. In a lot of ways, that's also, I think in a lot of ways, we have no problem saying that, cooking is externalized digestion and all that, right? I also think the process you go to obtain the food is a kind of externalized digestion and metabolism, right? Your body's going to react differently to the food if you've just run a shit ton and used your muscles and bones a bunch versus if you're just sitting and then you have the food, right? Which would also potentially explain why, even if you don't have the best diet, exercise can at least help with that to an extent. I think a lot of these things are coupled in a very sort of holistic way. Lucy, or multiple. It's so crazy. People figured out how to make DMT. All the ingredients are miserable. Yeah, how did people figure out DMT? Like, isn't that insane? Did olfaction play a role in that? Are there olfactory drugs, right, that don't involve sniffing cocaine? Like, what are there kinds of olfactory drugs? I think actually some folks in QRI actually talk about this, about, the certain kinds of altered states you can have from, olfactory sensory experiences.
Okay, so there's two examples I can think of humans like eating diseased like foods. And the first one, I think it's Wagyu like beef or something. If I'm thinking of the right thing, then basically what they do is they have a cow, they feed them like unhealthy food and then like don't let them move around, and intramuscular like fat like builds up in their like muscles and they have like metabolic syndrome. But like the humans like the taste of like or prefer like beef with like intramuscular fat, or at least like some of them do, and therefore that's essentially a preference for like diseased animals. And in a similar vein, there's, I think, forgive my terrible French, but foie gras, like fattened goose liver.
Yeah, foie gras.
Yeah, essentially they like horrifically overfeed like a goose until its liver is like filled with a bunch of fat and it's like extremely metabolically diseased. Very like cruel. But that's also an example of a preference for like a diseased animal's like flesh over a healthy animal.
Yeah. And, I mean, to be completely frank, if your options are to have that or to starve, you're probably going to choose to have that. And I think that the perceptual threat of starvation, right? Whether or not you will truly go starving, I think just the perception of having that threat is enough to make us start considering different things to consume. Like, sort of what we were saying earlier, like who the heck I mean, like, I always say some mushrooms make you see God, others will make you meet God. And without trial and error of just taking it and getting sick and or dying, what other way could people have figured it out? Maybe that's also where things like olfaction come in, right? Is, are there things that we're maybe less tuned into that, we could potentially pick up on if trained and contextualized, correctly. But, could there be olfactory properties that will let you identify if things maybe are more psychedelic than not, right? And again, I'm not just saying in the human olfactory context, I also mean for other animals.
Humans learn from other animals largely, right? Like what berries to eat, stuff.
That's true.
Maybe there is like a continuous chain all the way down to chemotaxis that kind of splits up in groups.
Yeah. Yeah, rotten fish, fermented tofu. I also heard there's fermented cannabis, which is very interesting. Because you have to remember, I mean, fermentation is one of the ways that we'd be able to actually maintain the usefulness of food for a bit, right? And I always say, like if you've ever had yogurt or cheese, congratulations, you're drinking spoiled cow titty milk, right? Like you're literally letting a bunch of tiny living organisms go and have sex and reproduce over the food that you're eating, and then you eat that. But then not only is that's not the end of the story, then they also do the same thing inside your gut, right? And probably other places in your body, as we find out more as well, which is interesting because this feeds into this whole idea of the ecosystem, right? And I don't think I think olfaction could be a very important aspect to understanding that ecosystem, because a good chunk of that ecosystem is probably using olfaction to identify things and potentially even communicate and do all sorts of stuff. I want to sort of do a quick run through of the future applications for what you three are working on and building, because I imagine there's probably a lot of people that would want to get involved, collaborate, potentially invest, and hopefully this would be a way for you guys to get access to that.
As previously mentioned, food, medicine, and also video games.
Yeah, those are the main applications. Food being the first and most applicable one. In most practical cases, you can use olfaction, heightened sensitivity of olfaction, and even with basic hardware in a lot of different use cases. I think for entertainment, it depends how well it's integrated, but I still think there's a large market there.
We have a new non-human scent dev board on the way. It has 8 sensors now, and NeoPixel indicator, ESP32 with BLE, yada yada. I'll make a new one with BMS as well, so that it's portable. And I talked to someone at MIT that's been working on olfaction for a while, and we were talking about kind of some of the fundamental limits to the MOX-based sensors and kind of going beyond that. We talked about my original idea was supplementing, because MOX is just the cheapest and most available sensing platform that you can actually just get and plug into a microcontroller. Does it have GPIO output? I'll get to that in a second, actually. Sorry. There's a lot of fundamental limits to the sensitivity. You can't even really get to the sensing threshold of flies in some situation, for specific types of compounds. So I was talking to this person. There are apparently commercially available carbon nanotube sensors that you can order from company, or you can order the solutions that you use to make carbon nanotube sensors relatively easily. So we're talking about trying to also get into playing with and kind of developing our own new sensor kits in the near future to kind of enhance the sensitivity and supplement the low-cost MOX arrays. But for now, this is a pretty good platform. I will add I2C output. Cooper, it does not have GPIO right now. It just has the NeoPixel, the SD card, and the array. But it'll be BMS right here, and then the I2C port, and then a GPIO port right here probably. But I got lazy and went ahead and ordered it. So that let me test that one before anyone orders it. I also finalized the old version. There was a problem with the old PCB that I figured out. But yeah, so soon, well, I guess this is something I should talk more about, but soon we should have a dev kit figured out and released and finalized, and then move on to the actual synthesis platform.
Awesome. Last thing, if anybody has any questions at all for Lucy, Shrestha, or Yo-Yo. By the way, where can everybody find all three of you on Twitter, websites? What's the preferred way of getting in contact with you?
Oh yeah, my website is tetraslam.world or .com, both work, and tetraslam on Twitter as well. So yeah.
I'm Indarashka on Twitter, and I use yo.cat. I also use Discord by the same username.
Oh yeah, Lucy, where can people keep track of what you're doing? And
Cool. Yeah, my website is eigenlucy.github.io. You can find me on Twitter at Eigenlucy, Lucy Moglia on LinkedIn. I am not, I have too many projects going on, but I have been doing a little bit better at actually documenting. So check out the project page there.
Awesome. And who would be the top, scientists, engineers, researchers that you all would want to speak with, maybe on another salon at some point in the future? Like top 3 choices.
How ambitious can I be?
As ambitious as you want.
George Hotz.
All right, Gio, hot. That's chill.
I would say Nikki Case. I have already emailed her previously.
Awesome. Lucy?
I don't remember her name, but there was an insect olfaction researcher that I would really love to talk to, and stereotypical answer, but Levin about the neuromorphic kind of machine learning principles.
Yeah, we'll have to get him on. Well, actually, now is a good place for me to talk about. But we do have a lineup of different salons and speakers over the next couple of weeks. So we have Dugan from the Wolfram Institute, who will be presenting at the FAU Sandbox and Machine Perception Cognitive Robotics Lab. He'll be presenting there. I think that's Wednesday. Then we have Paul Hahn on the whole electronic skin thing that he's building on June 5th. We have Willem Nielsen from the Wolfram Institute talking about the big paper they put out on meta engineering, right? The sort of computational properties of innovation. And then we also have a super special guest. We have Andres from Quality Research Institute, who will also be presenting at the Machine Perception Cognitive Robotics Lab at FAU. This is on, I believe we're doing it for June 9th. And I think that's actually going to end up being a conversation potentially between him, Eliade, who was on the call earlier from QRI, and then also Professor Will Hahn. I think some of you have already met Will Hahn. And I think that's sort of the lineup there. There might be a couple other ones that also pop up in the meantime. But yeah, this was a really fun time. I'm glad. It's always fun to do these things because I get to think about things and then we get to share it with other people. And my only hope is I hope it is valuable for everyone who spent their Saturday listening to this, tuning in live especially. But any lasting thoughts before we wrap up?
More computer smelling.
More computer smelling. I like it.
Oh,
Jess?
also someone described cryptography as digital pheromones.
Nice. I like that. I have a whole thing I was talking about the other day on perceptual cryptography, which I think I don't know, there could be some stuff there for sure. But yeah, Dugan, Michael, Cooper, anything else?
I just like messing with perception in general, so more of that,
All right, cool. All right, we'll catch everybody for the next one. You're all very much invited. So for Dugan, when he's speaking, we're going to have it at the university, but we're also going to do it hybrid, where people can join online, especially like, if you're in the Bay Area, you're very welcome to join for that, ask questions live, all that kind of stuff. And then also, I wanted to make sure everyone is subscribed to the Ekkolapto YouTube. We have a video on there that's getting some good engagement. It's a Scott Aronson UT Austin Salon. It's doing much better than I thought it would. I was surprised at how quickly it was sort of getting some engagement, which is cool. And make sure you're following all of our speakers on their Twitters and everything. And yep, we'll see you all for the next one. Take care. Peace.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.